Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Superman the Movie. Now, Superman the Movie, also known as Superman, came out in 1978. The film is directed by Richard Donner. Now, previously, Richard Donner directed The Omen, and after this, he would go on to direct movies like The Goonies and Scrooged and Lethal Weapon. Now, the film, of course, is based on the comic book character Superman, who was originally created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster and first appeared in Action Comics in 1938. Now, even at the time this movie came out, Superman was still a very iconic character. Now, this movie definitely introduced Superman to a whole new generation, and in a lot of ways, at the time this movie came out, this movie really did kind of redefine Superman. But even at the time this movie came out, like even prior to this movie coming out, Superman was still a very iconic character and was still a character who was very much ingrained into modern pop culture. Now, this of course was not the first adaptation of the Superman comics, nor was it really the first Superman movie. In the 1940s, you had the cartoons from the Fletcher brothers, and those could kind of count as movies because they were released theatrically, and they were technically just animated short films, and those were the first adaptations of the Superman comics. And in 1948 and 1950, you had two Superman serials. One was called Superman, which was released in 1948, and the other was called Atom Man vs. Superman, which was released in 1950. Following that, you had what is technically the first feature-length Superman movie, Superman and the Mole Men, which came out in 1951, which I just recently did a review on, and that's what spawned the television series Adventures of Superman, which had George Reeves as Superman. Now, prior to this movie, I would say that probably the George Reeves series, Adventures of Superman, was probably the most famous and most popular adaptation of the Superman comics. Now, in between this movie and the George Reeves series, you also had a few animated TV series based on the Superman character. Like in 1966, you had the animated series The New Adventures of Superman. Then you had the Superman-Aquaman Hour of Adventure and the Batman-Superman Hour. Superman was also a major character on the animated series The Super Friends, which was basically an adaptation of the Justice League. So once again, even prior to this movie, Superman was already a character who was pretty well known in American pop culture. Now, I have Superman the Movie on this DVD set here, where it also comes with all the sequels that were made to this movie. All the sequels, with the exception of the movie Supergirl, which I know is supposed to be set in the same continuity as this particular series of Superman films. Now, I shit you not, this movie was actually co-written by Mario Puzo, who previously wrote the book The Godfather, which of course the Francis Ford Coppola movies were based on that book. Now, in the movie, Christopher Reeve plays Clark Kent and Superman, and he does such a great job in this movie as Clark Kent and Superman. Now, I know a lot of people who say that Christopher Reeve's portrayal of Superman in this movie, for them, is the definitive Superman, and I can definitely see why people consider Christopher Reeve's Superman as the definitive Superman, because, like, he does such a great job in this movie as the character, and the way he plays Superman in this movie, he plays him with the right level of, like, morality, but also toughness, and also he's just so charming in his role as Superman, and he's also really charming as Clark Kent in this movie, and he does a good job at playing these characters as two different characters, even though they're the same person. Obviously, Clark Kent is trying to hide the fact that he's Superman, and Christopher Reeves basically plays him as, like, two different personalities, and he does such a good job in this movie. In the film, Margot Kidder plays Lois Lane, and she also does a really good job in this movie as the character of Lois Lane. In the film, Marlon Brando plays the character of Jor-El, who is actually Superman's birth father. And in the movie, Gene Hackman plays Lex Luthor, who is the main villain of the movie, and Gene Hackman does do a good job in this movie, but I did have some issues with the character of Lex Luthor in this film, but I'll get a little bit more in depth with that later on in this review. Now, Superman the movie, I do like this movie a lot. I do think it's a good movie. However, I feel like I would appreciate this movie more if I grew up on it more. Now, I first saw this movie when I was like 13 years old, and I remember liking it at the time, but I also remember it not making that much of an impression on me, and I just recently rewatched it for this review, and I have to say that it's definitely a good movie, but I do have some issues with it, but I think for its time, I mean, this film for its time was freaking groundbreaking in terms of what it did for the character of Superman and also what it did for superhero movies in general, because this was really the first, like, serious Superman movie. Even though there is a lot of comedy in the film, like, I would argue that the film is actually pretty much a comedy. There is still a lot of seriousness in the film, and, like, Superman's backstory in the film, it's all taken very seriously, and this was also the first, like, really big-budgeted superhero movie, and this was really the first time where subject matter like this was really taken this seriously to this level. So, at the time this movie came out, this movie was freaking groundbreaking, but I have some issues with the comedy in the film because I feel like the film is almost uneven with its mix between comedy and drama, because the way the movie starts out, where it's on the planet Krypton, right before Krypton is about to be destroyed, and you see Marlon Brando as Kal-El, who is Superman's birth father, like, a lot of that plays out like a serious science fiction drama, but then when it gets to Earth, like, the film becomes like a comedy in certain parts, and I feel like it just, I don't know, for me personally, it just comes off as a little uneven, and that's just me personally. At the same time, though, I do recognize that this is a good film, and I understand why people love this film as much as they do. I just have certain issues with it. And in the film, there are a lot of really ridiculous moments, which were definitely done intentionally, because I would say the film is probably mostly a comedy, even though it does have some drama in it. And some of the ridiculous moments in the movie I actually really liked, but some of them I wasn't too crazy about. Like, I wasn't too crazy about how a lot of the authority figures in this movie are shown to be almost cartoonishly incompetent, like, so incompetent that it's completely unrealistic. Like, it was all done for laughs, obviously, but I felt like it was too unbelievable, and part of what I think this movie was trying to go for was, at the time this movie came out, I think the film was trying to be kind of a realistic take on Superman, or at least, like, make it believable. Like, the tagline for this movie was, you will believe a man can fly, and I feel like with all, like, the cartoonish stuff in it, it just makes the Superman stuff that much more unbelievable, where I feel like if you set this in, like, a realistic world, it would have made all the stuff with, like, a Superman more believable. At least that's my opinion. But what I mean by authority figures being, like, cartoonishly incompetent, there's a scene in this movie where the military is transporting this, like, nuclear warhead, and Lex Luthor pretty much manages to hijack this thing by, basically, he has his henchwoman, like, in the movie, there's this woman who is kind of like Lex Luthor's girlfriend, and he has her, like, pretend to be passed out on the side of the road while the military is transporting this thing, and they stop, and all the soldiers leave their trucks to try to help this woman, and it's clear that all the soldiers pretty much want to do is, like, bang this woman or, like, kiss her or something, and, like, they all leave their trucks and leave this thing unattended. That's what I mean by, like, the authority figures in the movie being cartoonishly incompetent. Now, Lex Luthor in this movie, while I do think Gene Hackman did do a really good job as the character, to me the character was definitely more funny than intimidating, and I don't mean that to insult, like, Gene Hackman, because Gene Hackman did do a good job with how this character was written. I'm just saying, like, the character himself, he was a little too, like, he was a little too goofy for my taste and a little too comic book-ish. Now, granted, I haven't read any of the Superman comics that were being published around this time, and I actually haven't read that many, or really any of the Superman comics that were written before this. A lot of the Superman comics I have read are comics that were published after this, and I know later on in the comic books, the character of Lex Luthor was made into a much more three-dimensional character, and I feel like in this movie, though, and once again, I don't know if maybe this is reflective of how he was in the comics at the time, but I feel like he was just too cartoonish and too comic bookish. That being said, Gene Hackman did still do a really good job with how the character was written. So I have some issues with this movie. Mostly it's a lot of the really cartoonish stuff in the film, but overall I would say the good outweighs the bad in this movie. Now, one thing I actually really did like about this movie, and this is one of the ridiculous things, but it's one of the ridiculous things I actually really liked, is they kind of played around with a lot of the stereotypes and cliches that I think the mainstream audience thought of the Superman character at the time. Like, the whole thing of Superman going of Clark Kent going to change into Superman in, like, a phone booth. They played with that thing in this movie where Clark Kent, when trouble's happening, actually goes to change into Superman in a phone booth, but it turns out it's like an open phone booth that he can't possibly have any privacy in, and there's actually a scene in this movie where Superman actually saves a cat out of a tree. So there's definitely a lot of, like, there's definitely a lot of playing around with a lot of the cliches and stereotypes that surrounded the Superman character at the time. And I can't possibly talk about this movie without also talking about John Williams' score for the film, which is such a famous and iconic score. And John Williams had a hell of a career in the late 1970s. Like, he did this right after he did the Jaws theme and the Star Wars themes, so, like, he just had a hell of a career in the late 1970s. Now, the plot of Superman is, it's essentially 3 stories in one. The first story is set on a planet called Krypton, and it follows this scientist named Jor-El, who's played by Marlon Brando in the movie, who realizes that his planet is heading for destruction, but nobody's listening to him, and this segment of the movie ends with him putting his son Kal-El on a ship and sending it towards Earth before the planet of Krypton blows up, and basically he realizes that because Earth is an entirely different planet with a different sun, basically his son Kal-El will grow up to be different than regular humans on Earth. The second segment of the movie begins where Kal-El's ship lands in this field in Kansas, and he's taken in by this couple named the Kents, and they name him Clark and raise him, and this second segment of the movie is really about a young Clark Kent growing up, realizing he has these powers, and realizing that he is different from everybody else. And then the third segment of the movie is about a now adult Clark Kent finally becoming Superman, and eventually in the movie he finds out about Lex Luthor, and Lex Luthor has this plan to essentially set off bombs at the San Andreas fault line in California, which would cause a big-ass earthquake that would more or less destroy the state of California, so now Superman has to stop Lex Luthor, and that's the basic plotline of Superman. So yeah, Superman the movie. It is a good movie. I do have some issues with it, but overall I can definitely say it's a good movie. However, I will admit I probably would appreciate this movie more if I grew up on it more, but I do respect this movie a lot, and I understand what this movie did for the superhero genre in general. Like, if it wasn't for this movie, it's hard to say if we would even have, like, something like Tim Burton's Batman in 1989. Like, this film really started the whole serious superhero movie. Even though this is mostly a comedy, it was the first time a superhero story was done on this budget, and for the most part taken this seriously, even though the film is a comedy. And also, if it wasn't for this movie, it's hard to say if we would have, like, other adaptations of the Superman character, like the 90s series Lois and Clark, or the series Smallville, or even Superman the Animated Series, which is one of my personal favorite interpretations of the Superman comics. Now, this film had a couple of sequels made to it. In 1980, you had Superman 2, which was actually shot simultaneously with this movie, because the whole plan was to release both movies back to back. Now, I personally think Superman 2 is a better film, at least the Richard Donner cut, because there are two different versions of Superman 2, and the version I recently watched was the Richard Donner cut. I haven't seen the original version since I was a little kid, but the version I'll be reviewing next is the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2, and just based on the Richard Donner cut, I can honestly say I do think Superman 2 is a better film than the first one. Then in 1983, you had Superman 3, and then in 1984, you had Supergirl, which was more of a spin-off, but it was supposed to be set in the same continuity as these movies. Then in 1987, you had Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, and then in 2006, you had the film Superman Returns, which was kind of both a sequel and a reboot to the Richard Donner Superman series. And then in 2013, the series was rebooted with the film Man of Steel, which was also the first film to be set in the DC cinematic universe. So yeah, that's my review on Superman the movie, and bye.